issues that you all are here to talk about, and to put it in a larger context, particularly an economic context. So what I want to try to do is just give you a few key concepts and ways to think about this in the larger economic context, and even in the larger global context, beyond both local and even national issues. The most important concept there, which I think is implicit in how you probably already see things, but I don't think it's implicit in mainstream economics, is that food is different. Food is not the same as cars or forks or bicycles. Food is different. And the reason food is different is obviously because it sustains life. But it's also different because as an economic entity, because demand and supply don't work the same way, right? Economists talk about the demand for food being highly inelastic, and what inelastic means is that it's just not very responsive to price signals. It's not as responsive to price signals. And the reason for that is that one of the founders of U.S. agricultural policy coming out of the Great Depression commented that, the demand for food is inelastic because the human stomach is inelastic. And that actually gives a very good accessible understanding of the concept of elasticity in economics. But in a very practical sense, what it means is that when the price of food, because of oversupply, goes way down, you don't eat twice as much. When the price goes down 50%, you don't eat twice as much. And when the price goes up, you can't cut your consumption of food by half because you die. So food is much more essential to life, and the demand for it is somewhat fixed at the bottom end by sustaining life, and on the upper end by how much your stomach can handle. Food is also different because it is a resource-based product, and so it's intimately tied to resource use, and that becomes essential because because it has a direct impact on our environment, but beyond being, I think that's thought about more as we look at our industrial agriculture and the negative impacts on the environment. But it also has, modern agriculture has evolved by appropriating nature to sustain human civilization and human life. That's not a bad thing, okay? We wouldn't be here today if that hadn't happened. From the days when some indigenous people in Central America spotted this really weird plant and somehow figured out how to breed it into what we now call corn. If you look at the wild plant that started teosinte and became corn, you would never guess that anyone could have ever thought to play with that, to breed it, and to create what is now one of the most important food staples in the world. But the resource-based question, the fact that it is a resource-based product, means that its connection with the environment is intimate, and that has a lot of implications for brings I think brings very clear the limitations of a lot of traditional economic analysis and policy, and the need for a new economics of the food economy. And the reason is that economists talk about the presence of externalities. That is, the assumption of economics, of sort of mainstream economics, is that the market will determine prices, that supply of something will will be out there in the world, that the demand for it will be out there in the world. It is actually remarkable that those things meet in bizarre and unplanned ways in the vast marketplace of the local economy, the global economy, and a price forms, and that price that forms out of that balance of supply and demand then serves to allocate resources, right? It allocates, well, is it worth growing more of this? Is it worth producing more Ford Tauruses? No, because the price is going down, so we're going to produce something else. That actually, nobody's found a better way to set prices than that in the world. People have tried. Central planning served some purposes and didn't do a great job at setting some prices. So it's not that that price formation process is a bad thing. It's that it's inadequate. And so economists recognize that markets aren't perfect. And one of the ways they're not perfect, and this is the other concept that I just want to sort of try to ground your discussions in, is this idea of externalities, right? That when prices are formed, when markets work well, all of the costs are reflected in the price of a good. Food is clearly a case, agriculture is clearly a case where this is just not true, right? So think about, think about resource use. Think about what it takes to, is the water use drained out of the Ogallala Aquifer in the heart of the United States that sustains a lot of agricultural production and is being depleted at an unsustainable rate. Is the cost of that water actually reflected in the price that you pay for the products that are grown? No, it's not. The distortions these would be reflected seen as price distortions to prices, externalities. And they're called externalities because someone's paying for that, right? So it's externalized to the product and to that market. So the worst cases that we have of that are pollution, right? Where fertilizer runoff pours over applied fertilizer throughout the Corn Belt, flows into rivers, flows into the Mississippi River, flows down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico, and you get a dead zone, as it's called, depending on the year, the size of Delaware or New Jersey, in which, because fertilizer promotes algae growth kills everything underneath it. That's an externality. The people who are growing the corn aren't paying for that. The people who are shipping the corn aren't paying for that. The people who are paying for it, in effect, are the fishermen and the fishing communities. The tourism is paying for it because you have this dead zone. You can think of a whole variety of people who pay for it. Those externalities are recognized very clearly as things that happen in economics, that markets aren't perfect. And some markets are less perfect than others. Agriculture happens to be one where, because it's a resource-based industry, is highly imperfect. This makes the role of government particularly important because the role of government has been to step in and address those market distortions, those externalities. Think of the Dust Bowl. Okay, the Dust Bowl coming out of the Great Depression was a product of overproduction and exhaustion of the land. So overproduction using unsustainable practices, and the policy response was actually remarkably effective. It was modern U.S. agricultural policy coming out of the Great Depression, started limiting what you could grow on land, limiting the ways you could grow it on land, limiting the whether you could even grow on some land, and the soil erosion that stopped, those policies stopped, were truly a success story of U.S. policy. But they were responding to a market distortion. To illustrate what that all says about how that all comes into play in the international sphere, and that's where I work, is mainly I've done a lot of work on Mexico, on corn, and on biodiversity, agricultural biodiversity. And so think of all of that corn grown in the United States, that with all of its externalities, negative externalities, and there can be both, I'll illustrate that there are also positive externalities. The negative externalities of that are, right, the corn is produced and the price does not reflect the unsustainable water use, the pollution that's generated as a result of the process, a whole variety of things, and as a result, it's underpriced. That corn, under liberalized trade agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement, gets exported to Mexico in open markets that used to be more controlled because governments were accounting for some of the externalities. That the fact that the U.S. produced such cheap corn wasn't just because we're efficient. It's also that we have industrialized agriculture that doesn't actually internalize the costs of industrial production. That corn flows south, and what's it competing with? It's competing with highly diverse Mexican corn. Farmers there have cultivated agricultural biodiversity in corn for generations. They domesticated maize to start with. It's the center of origin of maize. There are 60 different defined families, varieties of corn that are grown in Mexico. That agricultural biodiversity actually serves as the raw material for modern crop breeding. The reason we have our monoculture, highly productive monoculture varieties grown in the Midwest is precisely because it was cultivated, generated, and improved over the years in these farmers' fields. And yet, that agricultural biodiversity has basically zero value in the marketplace. So that's a positive externality because the price isn't reflecting the domestication and improvement of maize and the maintenance of a very diverse gene pool for future crop breeding, even for industrial agriculture. The result of trade is that you bring underpriced U.S. corn in direct competition with undervalued Mexican corn. And what loses? Agricultural biodiversity, small farmers in Mexico, and the like. What does that say about the new economy? One, it says that a new economy needs to have an active role of government recognizing market failures. These are called market failures. That's not an outside of economics term that's throwing stones at the mainstream economics profession. Market failures are recognized as a piece of the market economy. The role of government is to correct those, and it can correct them in a number of ways. To correct them, you need to have an activist government that steps in to do that. And what that says about a new economy is that it says something about value, right? And I want to leave you with this, that the market is a remarkable place where value is established, right? Where value is determined. And like I said, there's never been anything that's done a better job in general of establishing value. The last 20 or so years has seen a move toward letting the market determine all value. And I would say that it's moved toward letting the market determine all values, our values. And I think you're here today because your values say food is different, food is worth something, food is part of our culture, food sustains us, the quality of it matters. And so a new economy is about reclaiming our values And instead of letting the economy, saying, well, we can't do anything, the market determines everything, is saying, no, the market is here to serve us. We're not here to serve the market. And with all due respect to the market and its amazing abilities to determine prices and set values, we have values that are more important, and we're going to manage the economy in a way that allows us to achieve those, to respect those values. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tim. Yeah, go ahead. So nice. We'll have fun.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah.
A little better? So I'm humbled to be asked to speak to you guys this morning. And also I see there's a lot of innovators in the room working very hard at this topic. Speaking of markets, actually, something interesting happened this past summer where we saw that the price of head lettuce locally, it was costing us less to make it locally than what it was to ship it in from the western part of the United States. Mostly makes to do with the droughts, right? We had this recurring issue with droughts in our great country. And to me, it really symbolized a lot of these conversations. It's the fact that, oh my goodness, we can produce things here closer to the end user, and we can do it more effectively, more efficiently. And also highlighted another thing about a lot of us is to be able to see it and do it is to actually do it. Get your hands dirty and make things happen. I was having breakfast with my daughter last Saturday, and she played the question game, and she said, "Hey, Daddy, who's your favorite female pop star?" And she goes, "Who's a teenager?" Yeah, I don't know many of those. And I said, let me ask you a question back. I said, well, who's your favorite, African American female heroine historian? She didn't like that game. That didn't go too far. But she did one other question. She goes, well, who's your favorite male pop star in the teens? I didn't know one. So, and then I asked her, I said, what's your favorite American company? And she said, City Fresh Foods and City Growers. And then she asked the question, well, she said, Dad, how did they start? And I realized that, I never really, the power of the origin story. And I'll just quickly tell you the origin story of City Fresh Foods, because I think it helps in this conversation. But I was teaching GED in Dorchester, working with these high school age kids, and looked around and said, wait a second, trying to prepare these kids for jobs, downtown and such. And so, well, how do we create our own jobs in our community? And I was able to convince the city to actually give us a loan/grant. That means it was a loan that we'd have to pay back. And we built out this kitchen on Dudley Street. And the initial concept was to provide takeout food to the Dudley area. People would call up and we'd bring the food down. And we built this kitchen out, and it was in the fall time. And right about December, November, the landlord turned the heat on in the place, and the pipes burst. And so I had a broken roof, and about $15,000 in that I personally signed. And I was like, well, I'm on my way to learn, Spanish in Mexico or something. I was done. And I got a call from. We had actually had an opening, and the mayor had come and get some press on it. So I got a call from one of the elder agencies who'd seen the article and said, hey, we see that you are doing ethnic food. Can you do it to the elders? And I was like, absolutely. I had no idea what they were talking about. But what I did is I called up a friend of mine who was in the business, and I said, hey, this guy Jerry. I said, Jerry, you know about Meals on Wheels? So he sat me down. I remember on a Sunday in his spot and gave me the layout of how the market worked. About a week later, I was in front of the executive director of one of the biggest elder services, agencies in Boston, and basically saying, of course, we're well and ready to do this. Interesting enough, in the elder agency world, they actually don't pay you until literally 45 days after the last day of the month of that service. So then I quickly learned about the powers of cash flow, because we at that time we were cash on delivery. So when the vendors were dropping off our product, we actually had to pay cash, literally, when they dropped it off. And they used to drop it off in front of our kitchen, and we didn't have enough space to. It was such a small little kitchen that they lined the streets with all the cases and stuff. I had to put something out there because we don't lose the product before it even gets into our kitchen. But we built this company up over time and to a point where, recently, we're literally competing with the big boys, right? You never know where you're going to be when you start, but if you stay around long enough, you can hopefully have some influence in some of these conversations. And I'll just quickly about the big boys, fast forward to, a couple of years ago when Boston Public Schools put their bid out for their food service, feeding 30,000 kids in the Boston school system. And at that point, I call it a bottom feeder. It was a. I think these guys are out of Philadelphia. I won't mention any names. I don't want any liability. But they were feeding our kids a lot of crap. And so a lot of folks behind the scenes were saying, well, how do we change that? And one of the big boys wanted to come into town, Sodexo, right? Because they actually are one of the bigger companies that feed a lot of our kids through the urban food system, school system. Long of the story short, here we are, sitting at the table saying, well, if you're going to come to Boston, this is how we're going to do things, right? And say, well, if we do this the way we want to in Boston, maybe we can influence how you do it across, because you're really feeding a lot of our kids across America. So you never know what you're going to grow up and turn into. But I do want to reference, and I can't believe I'm doing this, a biblical story. And I was just quickly refreshing my memory on David and Goliath, and I got to tell you, I love underdogs, and so I'm a big David fan. And if folks remember that story in the Bible, but Goliath, just I guess a 9-foot giant, all armored up, and he was terrorizing the Israelites. And David stepped up in there, had his little tunic on, his little staff, and he got that slingshot out, and he hit at the right spot, took that giant out. And I got to tell you, that's how I approach this stuff, because the giant, the Goliath, has never been stronger, and we got to figure out how to break through that armor, and because it's just unbelievable. I mean, folks who have kids and grandkids and all that stuff. I mean, we are dealing with such an urgency here. I mean, with terms of species extinction, carbon in the atmosphere, monoculture, soil depletion. I mean, we're sick, we're fat, we're unhealthy. I mean, you name it. We have the economies of incomes and wealth. I mean, it's getting worse and worse. So I mean, it just kind of makes me go like this, right? It's like was I reading the other day? I was reading that I guess Eisner, the Disney guy, he makes $37 million, a year. Where we're living in worlds where the other 99%, we know the stories. So the question is, what do we do, right? And kind of as Penn said earlier, kind of what's the vision here? And another couple quick little stories that came up recently, actually. One was I was watching this thing on the future of manufacturing. It was a PBS show, and they said 20 years ago, since the last 20 years, we've lost a third of manufacturing jobs in America, right? Where they go, we can debate that, right? The other thing that happened within the last 20 years, our production in manufacturing almost doubled, right? So what's up with that equation? So as I'm watching the show, they keep on coming back to these they go to these computer manufacturing places and you see these robots. I mean, just doing a lot of work, and not that it's all robots, but the bottom line is we have a functional situation happening in our economy. And another story broke. I think it was actually This American Life. I was listening to it. I don't know if I heard anyone listen to This American Life? Yeah. And did folks hear the story about folks with disability insurance? Remember they caught it? It was on a couple weekends ago. And interesting enough, the disability insurance ranks, we have 14 million people on disability insurance, and it's been steadily increasing. So when we talk about folks getting off of welfare, guess where they've been going? They've been going on to disability. And the thing about disability, the average person with disability makes about $13,000 a year through the government, and there's no upside. There's no pathway out. I mean, you're on. That's it. And you're basically sitting around and collecting that check. And for a lot of folks, that's the only opportunity, because guess what? All those manufacturing jobs not there anymore. So you see these things, and we have some serious fundamental issues that we need to be thinking about how to restructure. Interestingly enough, I was telling my partners at City Growers, is I think if you do it intensively, you can make more than $13,000 a year growing on a small plot of land in the urban community. That's the difference, right? That's the shift. So in terms of what can be in some of the vision stuff, keeping it pretty simple, right? How do we move from an extractive economy to a more sustainable economy? We've been taking things from the earth and using it up. How can we produce locally where we can? How do we provide things where it's like livable wages, right? Where folks can actually have a decent living, and it's sustainable. It makes sense in the long run, not the next generation, but as our natives say, 7 generations out. And how do we make this more democratic, more equitable in how we organize ourselves and who owns, which is a whole other story. Now I know I'm probably going to run out of time soon, but I'm a believer in the Davids I said earlier, right? The trim tabbers, the slingshotters. And this is the room. This is the energy that I love to be around, because we are the pioneers. We're the tip of the spear. We're the ones that are going to turn this thing. I actually looked up this thing quickly. I've heard about it. Everyone heard of the diffusion of innovation theory? I got to read it because it's too many big words for me. But they call it the minority group, which comprise about 14% of the population, which after innovators, the innovators is about 2%, right? Is first to try new ideas, right? The innovators, they try it. And in the processes and the goods and services. And the early adopters generally rely on their own intuition and vision. They choose carefully. They're usually above average education level. And for any new product to be successful, it must attract innovators and early adopters. So then it's accepted, and then it diffuses and moves on to early majority, late majority, and then the laggards, right? The other part of the curve. And I think we're on this. We're the early adopters and the innovators right now, and the energy's shifting, and a lot of it has to do with common sense. And how do we build on this momentum, but also create the right infrastructure so we can be here for a while? And I actually call on the entrepreneurs in the room, our entrepreneur energy, because this is what we do, is we figure out how to make it work. How do we build this thing? And I think today part of the topic is food is our guide. And I got to tell you, folks, I don't know if folks read the article in the New York Times about I think it was called Extraordinary Science of Addictive Junk Food. Michael Moss, he was an investigative reporter, and he got behind the scenes in the last 10 years. He was researching the food manufacturing companies, and these folks, they hire the best chemists, and they basically take advantage of what human nature is to gorge on salt and sweet and foods. And because I guess back in the day, you come across it, you never know when you're going to see it again. And our bodies are designed for this stuff. So these manufacturing companies, their entire manufacturing process, foods and all that stuff is built around that. It's like drugs, essentially. And as most folks in this room know. And but I have a theory, actually. If we can get people off these drugs, right? You wean yourself from it, clean your bodies, you'll actually have customers for life on the other side. And so that gives me hope. You see the rise of farmers markets, the rise of the CSAs. I was just someone sent me an article about this company Life coming out of California. They just raised a bunch of money, like $30 million plus. They got Oprah Winfrey's chef. They design these menus. They're going to be doing products in the stores and products in the restaurants, and they're partially vegan and so on and so forth. But it's about healthy eating. You got Live Life in Kendall Square, right? I think they have two spots. You go in these stores, and it's nice juices, and these places are veggie gal. Haley House down in Roxbury. So I get these calls on a regular basis. These kind of innovative food concepts. Like these guys, they quit their jobs out of Boulder. These two financial young guys in the early 30s, and they came over here to start this company called the Foodery, and they want to deliver food from sustainable sources. I got a call from this woman actually out of MIT actually. I shouldn't be saying this stuff. Let me slow it down a little bit. Anyway, they want to design a convenient way for parents to pick their kids up at childcare and walk away with, actually the kids eat really healthy in the place, but also the parents. All this kind of energy around, someone said everything from this table over here, right? Affordable, convenient, right? We got to beat these folks at their own game. The same way how Michael Moss finished his article. He finished his article with the folks, doing carrots, right, and packaging it in a way which is snazzy, get these kids eating these carrots. But this is the the shift. And I know I don't have a lot of time, but I do gotta give my little plug for what I think is a big solution to this on the market side, because to me, again, what drives a lot of change is the demand, right? It's the pull of the market, and it's the people like in this room, and tell your friends to eat the way you're eating, and so on and so forth, right? And we make sure these dollars, moving in the right place. But so my company, City Fresh, is a commissary, and I actually think that we're the commissary model where we're making the food and we're shipping it direct. And I actually think there's great growth potential, in that space. And again, it's how do we bring in local product, locally produced product, prepare it, and bring it back out to the masses. And I actually, between you and me, anyone else who wants to know and maybe invest, that's, I think, a big part of the solution into the future, right? Making this stuff affordable and convenient and trustworthy, so I think was the other one, and really easy for folks to say, you know what, I'm working hard, or I'm moving quickly, or so on and so forth, or maybe I'm a child in the school system. Here is, the right kind of food, the real food, and so we think, we think that models already exist. It's a matter of how do we scale up these models, help support these existing models, how do we leverage, our different assets and talents and resources and roles to build. I mean, a good friend of mine who started FoodX, he's an IT guy, jumps off ship, takes his own personal money, and now he's, filling that gap around, picking up the product from the farms, bringing them to universities like this, bringing them to retailers, and he's a kind of a local food trucking company. There was a big gap in the system. We have that now in the Boston area, but it's entrepreneurs who are willing to kind of step in and figure it out. He's still trying to figure it out from an economic model, but Godspeed as they continue to grow. And I'll end with this, and this is to me, it's I guess it's having the right diversity in the room, right, as we go about this. So if we look at urban farming and where is the land, it's in communities of color, let's be honest, right? It's in Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, and Boston, but if you go to other places, it's very similar. And if we're going to do urban farming, we got to make sure that the folks in these communities are at the table owning the process and owning the equity and having the power. And unfortunately, we don't always get that right. But so that's a big part of what City Growers is about, what the Urban Farming Institute is about, and it's not easy. It's not easy as we do this, but again, everyone has their role. And as I was introduced earlier, I mean, we have in the Boston area alone, we have 800 acres plus of vacant land. It's been sitting. It's going to sit for the next decades to come. And why not convert it into urban micro farms? And that's just one piece of a big puzzle, but it's an exciting one. And guess what? You know what? Another piece of land we go after that. Let's just look outside the urban neighborhood, right? Let's look at peri-urban. Let's look at the suburban folks, right? We're rolling out that sod and putting all these chemicals on these lawns. Why not? Are we not? Moving from, I don't know what it is, less than 1% of the population now is involved with agriculture? Okay, we don't have to go back to 20%, but let's maybe bring it back to 4 or 5%. I think that's more sustainable. That probably makes more sense. And it gets you to know your farmer, your producer. And I think for a happier place and a happier stomach. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so how much time do we have left for questions?